welcome. Thank you for joining us today for our Capitol Hill lecture. We appreciate you being here, and I think this is going to be a very, very informative hour of your time, and you'll be learning things and have a chance to ask questions that will, I think, be ideas that return to you as you go through your education and as you all go to law school, no doubt, in the future. I'm Roger Ream, president of the Fund for American Studies. We sponsor these programs with Senator Rand Paul's office. Senator Paul will be here shortly, we believe. He's on the floor voting. And I want to recognize a couple that is here from the great city of Milwaukee, Steve and Nancy Einhorn. They provide the funding that sponsors this program throughout the year. So we'd like to thank you, Steve and Nancy. They spent last night in the wee hours at a basketball game in Milwaukee, and got on a plane early this morning out of Chicago, and they brought me this great souvenir of the world champion Milwaukee Bucks. Means a lot. Next week, at the same time, same place, our lecture will be delivered by Randy Barnett, another constitutional scholar who teaches at Georgetown Law School. And you'll want to come hear him as well. And but Jonathan will correct everything in advance that Randy says that isn't correct. So I'm going to ask Nick Lally, a student from Hillsdale College who was an intern this summer with Senator Rand Paul, to introduce our speaker. Nick.
Well, how's everyone doing today? Okay, I'm going to ask one more time. It's going to be a lot better than that. How's everyone doing today? Great. All right, enthusiasm. I love it. Well, as he said, my name is Nick Lally, and I'm interning for Senator Paul this summer. It is my honor to introduce our speaker today, Professor Jonathan Turley. Professor Turley is a nationally recognized legal scholar who has written extensively in areas ranging from constitutional law to legal theory. Joining George Washington University's law faculty in 1990, he then became the youngest chaired professor in school history in 1998. He has written over 36 academic articles that have been featured in a variety of the top legal journals in the entire country in places such as Harvard, Cornell, Duke, among others. Additionally, he has served as counsel in some of the most notable legal cases in the past 2 decades as representing the employees of Area 51 and his work throughout the Clinton impeachment litigation. He is a frequent witness before Congress regarding issues such as the Constitution, tort reform, and statutory issues, and is also regarded as one of the most cited legal professors in the entire country. The recipient of the 2005 Single Issue Advocate of the Year Award, a frequent guest on NBC and CBS as a legal analyst, and one of my personal favorite speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Jonathan Turley.
Well, thank you very, very much. I didn't expect to be surrounded by Packers fans. I'm a Bears fan. So this is for Nancy, so if I say anything against the Packers, I just take it off. I want to thank you for showing up today. We're going to talk about a couple of issues that are much in the press. I want to start out by saying that I have done no gain of function research. As a law professor, we have no function, so that's a very easy one for me. No, it's great to be here, and I know Senator Paul is running late. I'm actually going to be speaking with his father in a couple of weeks. So in the Paul family, all I have to do now is just get a speaking opportunity with Carol Rand, and they punch a card and you get free coffee. So among libertarians, that's a huge windfall. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about what I call the rise of a shadow state and the risk that we are facing today with the creation of a type of outsourcing of governmental functions. As many of you may know, I'm a great advocate of free speech. That's one of the issues that probably define me more than any other. So I'm a bit of a broken record when it comes to the threat to free speech that we're facing in this country. And quite frankly, we're losing that war in a way that I would not have imagined just a few years ago. But I am also a bit of a dinosaur. I am a classic liberal in the sense of free speech. I believe the solution to bad speech is more speech and better speech. I generally oppose any limitations on free speech because I believe that they create an insatiable desire for censorship, speech regulation, criminalization. You only have to look across the ocean to see where that takes you. Europe has been going headlong into speech regulation for decades. And we have lost virtually every fight as a free speech community that we have faced in Europe. There have been a few victories, but not many. But what does it have to do with this idea of a shadow state? And the answer is that increasingly we've seen in the last couple of years a strange transformation, almost like the way the Earth's magnetic poles tend to flip every eon. And that suddenly you have Democrats espousing the virtue of corporate speech and corporate governance, and Republicans arguing these populist, in some cases, anti-corporate positions. And one could imagine that you'd be a tad confused by this reversal of fortunes. The result is convenience. The reason is convenience. The Democrats have increasingly found that corporate governance is a good thing. And the reason is obvious, that private entities are not covered by core protections in the Constitution. The First Amendment was designed to restrict the government because the framers believed that the greatest threat would come from the government. And indeed, that was the case. That until when Madison designed the Constitution and when the Bill of Rights was written, 90% of the threats against individual rights were coming from the state. They didn't imagine the rise of an administrative state, and they didn't imagine the rise of what is essentially a corporate state. So what do I mean by that? I'm not arguing that the United States is in control of the Trilateral Commission. I haven't gotten to that tinfoil point in my development. What I'm saying is that people are now identifying corporations as the best sources for regulation. Let me give you two examples. It's notable that the White House recently has said almost as a mantra that they want private companies to impose effectively vaccine passports or mandatory vaccine certification. At the same time, they say that that is not what they want to do. In fact, the press secretary said, that's not something that we want to get involved with. But then in the very next sentence, she said, but we have encouraged corporations to impose mandatory requirements to go to a restaurant, to get on an airplane, to go to the movie theater. This has been reaffirmed over and over again by many in the media without really thinking about the implications of that type of outsourcing. If the government were to impose a national mandate for vaccines, there would be court review and there would be some challenges. It's not clear what the federal authority is in dictating those types of requirements to the states. Public health was originally, with police powers, the dominion of the states. There is a decision, the Jacobson decision in 1905, out of Massachusetts that upheld a state mandatory vaccine program. And so there is language, there is precedent for a mandatory requirement. Whether that would extend to the federal government because of the existing statutes is a point which would be resolved by the states. There's good arguments on both sides, in my view, as to the legal basis for that. But it's a lot simpler if a private company does it. Because a private company is given a great deal of leeway, particularly with the CDC saying, look, we think everyone should be vaccinated. They have serious concerns about the Delta variant. There are serious medical issues there. So companies are likely to prevail, including non-for-profit corporations like universities in requiring these types of mandatory vaccinations. But this was a very clear case, a very conscious decision of shifting what was a debate over a government mandate and giving it to these corporations to carry out. Now take a look at free speech where I began. There, it is a lot more concerning to me. Because we have today the largest censorship program in the history of this country, and indeed, it is probably the largest censorship program in the history of the world. Even if you take the Great Wall of censorship in China, it actually dwarfs in comparison to what is now carried out on a daily basis by Facebook, Twitter, and the other social media companies. This is a massive system of censorship. Now, I've testified in both the House and Senate on this, and I know that senators like Senator Blumenthal refuse to use the word censorship. Instead, the word is robust content modification, which is this perfectly Orwellian way of referring to censorship. But it is censorship. There's no possible way you can say it's not. It's private censorship, but it's censorship. And it's also censorship where these companies are taking a position. They're taking a side, from gender identification to pandemic issues to electoral fraud. Twitter was recently admitted that it was even censoring criticism of the Indian government, which was amazing because the criticism was coming from doctors who were trying to save people's lives and were trying to identify corrupt and mismanaged programs in the Indian government. They were censored. And Twitter said, well, yeah, we did that. So the issue here is who in the United States is the protector of free speech today? Who is it that controls, frames the speech allowed in the United States? And the answer is no longer the United States government. The answer is the social media companies, because social media is our primary form of speaking today on political subjects. It is the most common way for people to be heard on political issues. So you have a handful of companies that are framing these questions. You're only allowed to speak on those platforms if you speak the truth, as defined by these boards. And the boards are composed of some good people. You know, Michael McConnell is a friend of mine. We're about to have a debate, actually, tomorrow. And Michael is one of the people on the Facebook board, which I hope that by tomorrow evening he will see the error of his ways and immediately resign and apologize to me and everyone. But Michael is a very thoughtful person, a former judge. It is not that I'm attacking him or the members of the board, but that is a censorship board, plain and simple. It is a board that does nothing but censor the views of people that the company's position is opposed to. So you see this interesting dynamic on the Hill. There was this hearing, and forgive me if I go over just, and I'll stop for questions, but I'm trained to speak in 50-minute increments as an academic. There was an interesting hearing in the Senate when all the CEOs came to testify about social media. And the matinee issue in this hearing was because Twitter had finally admitted that they should not have censored the Hunter Biden laptop story. Now, in case you have been living on Mars, this was a controversy involving a laptop that was clearly from Hunter Biden. Yeah, the Russians can engage in a lot of stuff. It's pretty hard to fake those hundreds of photos in Hunter Biden in various points of undress, but it's also really hard to fake the emails when you've got the other recipients saying, yep, yeah, I got that, right? So within a few days of this thing being turned over, we also found out that the FBI, oh, here's the great man himself. Okay. We also found out that the FBI had seized and copied the laptop earlier, right? So we get this big hearing, right? All the social media execs come in, and Jack Dorsey does one of his wonderful Bien Ben Phu confession moments and looks in the camera strangely from his kitchen. If you notice, he always does this from the kitchen. I'm like, what the hell is that? Why? It's like he has plates behind him, like he's Julia Childs, and we're about to see how to properly cook a chicken. And so he tells these senators, you know what, we shouldn't have done that. We missed that one. Now, of course, this is after the election, so you bury the story. At the time, plenty of us were writing saying, what the heck are you doing? Right? This is clearly a legitimate story. And by the way, if the laptop is fake, it's an even greater story. So either way, it should have had wall-to-wall coverage. And he says, you know what, we made a mistake. We shouldn't have done that. Okay? What was the response of Senator Blumenthal to that? If you go back and look at the hearing, he immediately turns to Jack Dorsey and says, we want your assurance that you're not going to backtrack on robust content modification. We want your assurance you're not going to backtrack. So this guy just admitted that he killed a major story affecting the President of the United States and his son weeks before an election. And the response is, we want your assurance that this isn't going to deter you from greater content modification. And then his other colleagues said, yes, and we want content modification on climate change, on gender identification, et cetera. And all these CEOs said, okay. So why is that? And the reason is very, very clear. Because the Congress and political leaders can do things indirectly they can't do directly. The Congress could not possibly censor people the way that these social media companies are censoring. It would be struck down in a nanosecond. So instead, the Congress has dangled this issue of immunity in Section 230 over these companies, but they really don't have to. See, that's what's fascinating for those of us in the free speech community. The most fascinating thing for me in the last few years has been how wrong we were. I'm a Madisonian scholar, so quite frankly, I find this century confusing. I much prefer to be back in the 18th century. With James Madison, my kids would tell you he's not joking. But one thing that we were wrong on for centuries is that we've always talked about state media as an issue of official propaganda departments, a ministry of information. And much like the Constitution itself, which is focused on government action, most of what we've written is about official propaganda devices. What we've seen in the last few years is that you can have an effective state media without any coercion, with ideological agreement. There's no central ministry, and yet narratives become clearly stated and faithfully followed across media platforms. It's an astonishing thing. Now, furthering that along is, in my view, the demise of journalism. I've worked for various networks, from CBS to NBC. I write for various newspapers as columnist. I've done this for 3 decades. Like free speech, I never imagined that I would see the day where journalism professors are now arguing that objectivity itself is a fault, that journalists cannot be objective, that they have to be advocates in order to be a journalist. And so it's a perfect storm. You have government officials who are openly calling for censorship. You have corporate officials who are directly wedded to that political viewpoint, and journalists who are actually calling for more censorship. The head of the School of Journalism at Columbia, one of the 3 top schools of journalism, came out in favor of censorship. Think about that, right? It's like the president, of the Meat Association coming out as a vegan. I mean, the head of one who some consider the premier journalism school in the United States came out for censorship and said, we can't allow, this is a direct quote, the weaponization of free speech. So what does all of this do to us as a democracy? The thing is, a lot of people, in my view, engage in defamation when they refer to a constitutional crisis. You won't hear me say that, maybe in an unguarded moment, but I don't think I've ever said it. And the reason is because the Constitution is not in crisis. were in crisis. James Madison gave us a great gift. He gave us sort of the all-terrain vehicle of constitutions. It's not pretty. When people come up to me and say, oh, Professor, I just wanted to say hello, I love reading the Constitution. It's so beautiful, and I know they've never read the Constitution. Because the Constitution's, it reads like the tax code. It was written by a wonk who was about that tall, and it was not given to adjectival embellishments. You want to read a beautiful Constitution? Go and read any of the French constitutions. You can choose because they failed so often. But those things are beautiful. They talk about the rights of man and the horizon that we're all moving towards. They're all written in what I call that Bud Light, I love you man moment. Remember that commercial where the guy tries to get a Bud Light by saying, I love you man, he pulls the beer back, right? The problem is that all the French constitutions were written in that I love you man moment. They overthrew a government, they loved each other, they had a party like the French could only do. And then the next morning, they wake up and they go, wow, you're not quite what I thought you were. And so they would fail within a week in one case. Madison premised the Constitution on something different. He premised the idea that we could have these conflicts of power, no branch with enough power to govern alone. He actually created a constitution to trigger fights between the branches, fights between us. He wanted it in the open because the thing that killed the governments that he studied, and no one had studied governments, with the exception of Montesquieu, as much as Madison. What killed those governments is that they were based on systems that let our divisions fester below the surface until they exploded in the streets of Paris. So he developed a system that brought us out in the open, made us to be honest about our divisions. That system has survived crises that reduced other countries to a fine pumice. But this is different. I have to tell you, we've never seen this. We've never seen this degree of outsourcing to a type of shadow state. And things like vaccines and free speech. We've never seen a media that is actually now embracing the concept of advocacy over reporting on a large scale. And we have never seen this degree of speech control, where you can be a company like Parler and get crushed within 48 hours if you're a competitor. That's the reason your generation is probably the most important generation in the history of this country since the original generation. You are. And the odds are against you. And it's going to be tough, and it's going to make you unpopular. But we all talk about that Ben Franklin moment. Remember, it's in every speech about how Ben Franklin left the Constitutional Convention, was asked by Mrs. Powell, what have you wrought? And he said, a republic if you could keep it, madam. That's a wonderful soundbite. But if you really think about it, it's chilling to the point of glacial. What he was saying is that in every democratic system, you have the seeds of your own destruction. Every generation has to renew that commitment because the Constitution is just an article of faith. That's all it is. It's an article of faith in each other, but it means that every generation has to take a leap of faith. It means that you have to fight for people whose views you hate and disagree with. You have to fight for them, for the right to say it. And you have to stand up when people call you every name in the book because you want to support first principles. That's a burden, I must tell you. I don't think any generation has had to carry for free speech. We've had great generations, the Second World War generation, but they, in some ways, they knew what they were fighting. They had terrible tyrants. They were protecting freedom. We've had great generations for the desegregation movement who fought raw racism. Your generation, however, is going to be a fight among ourselves to a point that is going to be very difficult because defending free speech today is often confused with defending specific ideas. Arguing against corporate governance systems is treated as being reactionary. I think your generation is up to the task. But I must tell you, at the end of this, if you succeed, there will be no generation that is greater than this one.
Thank you.